Okay, this is my presentation of The White Disease, whether it was actually an anti-Nazi play or whether it was just interpreted by the audience at that time. So just some context about the playwright. He was born on the 9th of January in 1890 and he died in December of 1938 from pneumonia. The Nazis actually didn't realise he died, and then they sent the Gestapo to his house to then interrogate his wife, and then they realised he died, which I just thought was an interesting fact. But he was a Czech writer, a playwright, a critic, and a journalist. He was very important in Czech literature. If you Google his name, it will come up with all his accomplishments and everything he contributed. But I'm not going to put that all on here. One thing I think is important to note is he was exempt from the military in World War I for a spinal injury. So he did just witness the war from Prague. Just to point out, he didn't actually fight in it, but it still had a lot of influence on his views, particularly on politics and war. There's just three of his previous works, all of which are very anti-totalitarianism. It's a very common theme in all of his work that he's very against dictatorships, no matter what kind of dictatorships are, which kind of hints to the fact that it might not be an actual anti-Nazi play and it might just be the audience interpretation. But he was very outspoken against fascism in the 1930s when he was alive, and it was no secret to anyone that he detested the Nazis. So just a bit about Czechoslovakia in the 1930s. I don't think I need to fully explain to everyone in this room. The Nazis were in power, they were a huge threat, especially to Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia had part of the Sudetenland, which had quite a large German population compared to the rest of the people. So obviously, throughout the whole 1930s, there was a big thing of living space for German people, and that really put the government on Czechoslovakia on edge. And just before this play was produced, in about 1936, they gave the Rhineland in France to the Nazis, and the French put up very little resistance. And as France was one of Czechoslovakia's closest allies, it did not bode well for the future of Czechoslovakia in the 1930s. So across the whole nation, it was very much big on anti-Nazis, and that was clear through a lot of the literacy work that came out of that period. But yeah, obviously you've all watched the play last week. There's a lot of things in it that do stand out as being very anti-Nazi, but perhaps the biggest thing is the position that Czechoslovakia found itself in the 1930s. Obviously that audience is from 1937, they are living in that time where they have every reason to think that a Czechoslovakian produced film in 1937 that is anti-dictatorship is obviously going to be about anti-Nazis. So they probably interpret it as that. And as well as this, the play features a big militaristic country demanding war against other smaller countries, which is very much like Nazi Germany in Europe. And again, the play urges resistance against these evil forces and the importance of ethical responsibility, which goes exactly against Nazi ideology, hence, hinting that it is an anti-Nazi play. And on top of this, the main character, he calls for peace, which is again very anti-Nazi. Everything about this play does scream like anti-Hitler, anti-Nazi, and it's not a fault of the people watching it that they would interpret it like that, obviously based on their situation. And on top of all of this, the play was banned in Nazi-occupied areas. Although this was directly after, when Czechoslovakia got invaded in the 1938, so after the play was put on, it is clear that it wasn't just the audience then that interpreted anti-Nazis, so did the Nazi regime. And as easy it is to make these parallels between the Nazi Party and the evil in the play, it's important to note that what I will show you next is the reason that it might not be interpreted as fully anti-Nazi, it might just be interpreted as anti-authoritarian. It's important to note that it's deliberately set in a completely fictional world. They don't use any country names. Even the disease, it's just called the White Plague. There's no hint that it's a real life disease that's from anywhere. And this is left deliberately ambiguous by the author. You see it in his preface, which I'll talk about in a bit. And it's that he wants to prove the fact that it's not just about Nazi Germany, it's not just this one case in history that has happened. He wants to leave it open to interpretation so it can be used beyond just the 1930s. Again, in the preface, there's a quote there that says that the whole disease was symbolic of the deep moral decline in the white race, which again isn't directly pointing at Germany. It isn't saying that the Nazis are responsible for this and it's their fault. It's saying like anything that is symbolic of this, it doesn't necessarily have to be Nazis, it could be any sort of authoritarian regime. And that raises the question that if it was truly just a piece of anti-Nazi propaganda, why wouldn't the playwright just name and shame? Like, why wouldn't he just say, this is based in Nazi Germany, this is the country they're invading? Because then, for the time, it would be a lot better as a piece of propaganda because it would identify an enemy a lot more easier. So that just raises that question. And also, as an argument against anti-Nazi, against it only being an anti-Nazi, we see that there's themes in this play that don't just relate to the Nazis at the time. For example, the camps they end up creating for the sick people. Yes, it is related to Nazi Germany and the concentration camps, but it can also be reminiscent of Stalin's gulags, which were camps in Siberia. So it's important to note that while, yes, it is anti-Nazi, it can also be anti-authoritarian in Stalin's regime, which was also heavily present in the 1930s and heavily despised by a lot of different countries. Yeah. Other arguments to show that it's not just anti-Nazi is all the broader themes that are put on in the play. The play is very anti-war and anti-military in general. No matter what the country is, no matter what the situation is, he's not calling for one specific country to get rid of all their weapons and do all this. He's calling for everyone to get rid of all the weapons, proving it's not just blaming one people, but blaming like the entirety of the world in general. But also there's a core theme of ethics and pacifism. This can be seen in the Doctor. He's at this constant moral struggle of does he help the sick people or does he just help the sick poor people? And because he chooses not to do everything right, he has a moral struggle. But it also shows in the authoritarian regime that's in the play, the accountant's wife and the baron, they all get sick and yet they choose to not do anything and not go against the regime rather than save the ones they love and save themselves, which also just deals with ethics and pacifism. And more importantly, it questions populist views and the populations and how they enable the dictators. We see at the end of the play the massive crowds, they're all cheering on the dictator and they end up being the reason why he dies and why the doctor dies and why there's no cure, because they're so for this dictator and they're so for war and they don't critically think about it that they just kill a doctor for shouting peace, which is insane in general, but this really raises the questions of, populations should be able to stand up rather than just, cheer on the dictator. And it also highlights how the brutality of individual activity against mass movements isn't always the best idea. Like we see the doctor just get beaten to death, and that kills him, but it also kills the cure. Whether he'd worked together and perhaps got more people on his side, perhaps there would have been a different ending or anything like that. And I think it's just important to note that it's not only my opinion, but the opinion of other people that have written academic works about it, that it's recognised as universally approachable. It's not just seen as an anti-Nazi film, and it's not just seen as made to be propaganda against the Nazis. Yeah, as I was saying, there's a preface to the play that is just there when you read the play. And I think it's a really important bit for everyone to read. I've got some of the key quotes I found from there and the page numbers. But it pretty much just, he gives his opinion and why he wrote the book. And as you can see from the quotes, there's a lot of different reasons, like the effect that the war had on him. It really made him lose faith in a lot of humanity. It made him see that these authoritarian regimes are going against all that he thinks Europe stands for and the traditions of Europeans and European democracy. And he describes there's a collision of two ideals, obviously democracy and then this other evil one, and he describes it as supremacy and expansion, anti-human. And again, that's not just related to the Nazis, but related to any authoritarian regime at the time. And it was a global phenomenon. Just in Europe, you had Stalin and Hitler, but there were many other regimes that were to come in the 1940s and beyond. But in this specific case, it's not just about Nazis. And yeah, the next one, he specifically states that the reason he didn't include any names or anything is so that people don't think about real illnesses or real states. Instead, they think about just the ideas that he portrays as a whole and not relating them to real life, but just, the broader themes of it. And then that's how he ends the preface, and it just says, in the end, the crowd is without compassion, it tramples the two heads of both sides, which again is him critiquing the crowds and the populations that support these people with no thought behind it, and they will kill people just because they go against them, which he was really critical about. And then just after that, he quotes that human life will pay for this with pain. And I think it's important to highlight, he doesn't say any specific human life will pay for any specific thing, that just humanity in general will pay for it, which just reiterates the fact that it's not meant to be a one-time play that has a one-time use, but it's meant to be seen throughout generations and they all have the same consequences. Yeah, and then this is just a bit about why I think it matters.
Oh. Yes.
This is just why I think it matters, and why there needs to be a clear distinction whether it's anti-Nazi or anti-totalitarianism. I think it makes it so that the play is relevant beyond World War II. Obviously it was incredibly relevant, it was incredibly relatable at the time, but even today, in today's culture in countries all around the world, it is still incredibly relevant. And I think that's one of the points that he wanted to drive in the preface. And also, the move away from it just being anti-Nazi allows the audience to focus on the other key features of the film that I mentioned, like how he's against populations thinking without critically, going against the authoritarian regime, and how it's not necessarily right that the doctor chose to keep it to himself instead of giving it to other people and it dies with him. And lastly, it just highlights the flaws in all the characters, not just the one evil characters, because there's not necessarily good versus evil in this film, it's rather evil versus slightly better. And I think it's important to highlight that because, everyone has their flaws, and if you look at it from just a point of view that it's completely anti-Nazi, then you're not going to see the flaws in all the other characters. But yeah, that's just the conclusion I came up with. That the people watching it were right to think it was anti-Nazi, and especially at the time in a life situation, it was very anti-Nazi. But obviously, it's so much more than that. And to brand it as just anti-Nazi, I think, takes a lot of what he meant to bring to the play away from it. And yeah, that's it. There's a bit at the end.
Thank you very much. It was very carefully prepared. Thank you very much. I'm again impressed by history students who have been taught how to deal with secondary sources, and that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Very good. Do you have any criticisms or comments? I would just like to say thank you. That there is a little hint when Dr. Gallen goes to see that man Sigelius, I have something wrong with my heart, and Sigelius says, well, let me have a look at you, and says, I'm actually, this is not what I'm talking about, what I'm thinking about. So basically, if anybody objects that crowd kind of killed him at the end, he had a weak heart, basically, angina pectoris or something like that. So it was probably quite easy to actually kill him. Thank you very much. Well, just a few words. We're going to have another film, this time from the total German occupation, 1941. It's yet another entertainment film, kind of reverting to what we saw in the first week in 1933, that Life is a Dog even has a kind of similar title, Life of an Adventurer is Hard, and it is totally escapist and entertainment, and people did go to the cinema, as I'll show you by playing you a an interview in a wee minute, which I won't be recording on the video because everybody can see it on Moodle. But quite interesting comparison with that film from 1933. The film in 1933, okay, there is this issue of youth unemployment, but otherwise it is taking in an open space. It's basically a love affair stuff, sort of open, daylight, bustling, modern industrial city of Prague. This one is mostly probably shot in studio space, but quite interestingly, there isn't, as far as I can remember, a single shot which would be shot in daylight. It is everything in darkness. So basically it's quite claustrophobic, and even though it is about a young author of thrillers and his kind of alter ego, his character that materializes allegedly, that's like some film by, some American film by, what's his name? Anyway, that a character escapes from the screen. But while it seems to be like a total normal entertainment, it ends very unexpectedly in a very authoritarian Nazi way, which is not openly like we are Nazis or whatever, but the ending certainly is very questionable, and I don't want to sort of betray it. I won't tell you about it now. You see tomorrow, you can consider it. So it is quite interesting because it's a Czech film made from in 1941, 2 years after the Nazi occupation. On Moodle you have an interesting kind of document about what happened when the Nazis took over the Prague film studios. But actually it was decided, as you will see in that interview that I'll play you now, that the Czech films should be made even under the Nazi occupation. And also in the first few years of the Nazi occupation, many Czechs thought that maybe it won't be so bad, but then that killer Heydrich came to be appointed Reichsprotector of Prague, so the murders started, and then of course the paratroopers sent from Britain killed him, so there was a sort of wholesale revenge, massacring people, so later on it wasn't so funny. But anyway, so this film is supposed to be entertainment, forget about your occupation, but then you can't because it ends weirdly, which you will see tomorrow. Okay? So I'll stop the video now and then have a look on Moodle for a bit.
So it was, when it premiered in 1937, it was given a 30-minute standing ovation and hailed as an anti-Nazi play. But is it anti-Nazi? So just a brief bit of background. Karel Čapek was born in 1890, and at the beginning of World War I, he was studying at Charles University in Prague. He graduated in 1950, having been medically exempted from the war due to spinal injuries throughout his life. He viewed the war from Prague. He witnessed many horrors and wrote journalistically about this, as well as topics like nationalism. He was very interested in nationalism as well as like greed and selfishness, and wrote various social critiques with a very keen critical eye. In his preface to The White Disease, he specifically notes the conflict between democracy and dictatorship and the increasing violence this creates as inspiration for the play. He also mentions the deliberacy of bringing the play setting into a fictitious sphere so that it would not be necessary to think about real states and regimes. From this we can understand that Čapek, through his work, took great interest in critiquing systems and human behaviour, but not necessarily through direct comparison. I will also say at this point, I'm mostly talking about the play because the questions about the play, I do mention the film a couple of times, I kind of go between them. But some of it is more, some of it works better for different reasons. So, what is it critiquing then? When The White Disease premiered in 1937, it was very well received by critics and the public, but was specifically interpreted as anti-Nazi. It's understandable how this arose. The fictional military dictatorship bears a great resemblance to Nazi Germany, with the character of the Marshal as a charismatic leader who, in the film, is first presented pronouncing his country's right to conquer for more space, which is very similar to the Nazi goal of Lebensraum, or living space. Additionally, Dr. Sigelius' solution of sending lepers to camps to die away from the public rather than continuing to be treated as members of society is obviously draws very noticeable comparisons to the Nazis' concentration camps, which by 1937 were already housing othered members of the public like the homosexuals and the disabled. However, we have to consider authorial intent in the play. Čapek deliberately places the narrative in a fictional country rather than in Germany or Czechoslovakia, so the play can better focus on its moral critiques. The country obviously draws inspiration from the Nazi regime in Germany, but to act as a backdrop for the quandaries that Čapek's presenting. The White Disease holds much more nuance than simply critiquing one regime, and Čapek seeks to show a wider and deeper critique that can be applied globally. So, one of the key things that he is critiquing in The White Disease is how becoming entrenched in ideology can blind you to the wider world. Originally in the play, the country seems to exist in a vacuum of sorts, with Dr. Galen believing that if the Marshal just stopped militarising, then the entire world would stop militarising. And aside from brief mentions of China, Greece, and like the kind of small neighbouring country, it's completely self-contained. This is deliberate from Čapek. By restricting the play spread, even in his leaving this setting unnamed, he reflects our two opposing sides' blindness to all outside of their ideological crusades. This blindness is intended to highlight the selfishness of those moral struggles that end so stubbornly. Although the Marshals' violent crusades are absolutely worse than Galen's pacifist idealism, Čapek still criticises his refusal to treat the wider world in attempts to reach his political goals. However, as this cocoon of isolation translated less well on film than it did in the theatre, the film introduces the new character of Dr. Martin, who is the doctor from the neighbouring country. Through him, Galen is directly confronted about his refusal to think about the wider world, and as such, he shares the formula for the cure with Dr. Martin, although with strict kind of conditions. While this change does make the White Disease's ending much less bleak than in the play, the change does still underline Čapek's message, as the audience are directly presented with Galen's failings instead of just presented with him as a blindly good character. This parallel between Galen and the Marshal is key to Čapek's stance against ideological crusades, but it's not the only example in the play. His critiques of militarism are also essential to looking at his stance in his writing. Čapek sets the play in a military dictatorship to show how a culture of violence and aggression impacts the humanity of those living under it. In Act 1, we find Dr. Sigelius describing the plague with like an unsettling pride almost to a journalist. He's not concerned about its actual harm to others. He's only interested in the notability it would bring his clinic if he got the first European diagnosis. While at first this apathy may simply seem to be Sigelius' character alone, we quickly find this isn't the case. Across the play, almost every character demonstrates a shocking disinterest in the welfare of others, especially we especially see this in characters who are very linked to militarism. The father characters discussed his upstairs neighbour being ill with the plague, his children's view of the plague creating more space for the young, the doctors prophesying of cures that don't work. All of these things are fed by militaristic nationalist propaganda of the country, exacerbated by closer contact with this.
Yes, this reminds me, if I may interrupt, we've all gone through COVID, right?
Yes.
Imagine, and people died, older people died. Imagine if in Britain young people said, good that they are dying, there will be space for us. You see, absolutely outrageous. Anyway, go on.
Sorry. Yes. For example, the Marshal's visit to the clinic and father's promotion in Baron Krug's arms industry draws them closer to the nationalist regime. This culture of apathy ties into an appetite for violence fostered by war, very clearly seen in Act 3 of the play. Upon Galen refusing to state support for the war while walking through the Marshal's rally to treat him, he's beaten to death by the angry public. And in the play, I don't remember if this did happen in the movie, but in the play, the angry mob is led by the son character. And they don't care that they've murdered him. I think the quote is, I had it on the slides, but it's, who cares, one less traitor, hail to the Marshal or something. So this linking of militarism and nationalism has created a populace unable to separate violence from patriotism, with no intent to change on a large scale. As Baron Krug's son says to the Marshal, they have not been taught how to do things themselves, only how to follow ideological patterns. Čapek instructs this setting to display the dangers of tying national identity to militarism and the inevitable disasters a violent state brings. The country's citizens literally cause their leaders death through fanatical support for him, and their culture of violence remains. It's also very important to note that despite this public's unfailing patriotism and fanatical devotion to their warring state, the military endeavours are prioritised over the well-being of the citizens and their country. For example, in Act 2, Scene 3, Sigelius is happy that people have their heads too full of the war, to worry about the disease. This comment feels really pointed from Čapek, as the fanaticism over the war in society only leads to greater suffering, as the violent grabs for power are prioritised over attempting to help and cure people in the space that they already have. In this way, Čapek shows how, despite their support for it, the militaristic nationalism of this fictitious nation does not benefit its citizens, but instead furthers the wealth of the rich and powerful who profit from war. Čapek also notably criticises the greed and selfishness of the rich and powerful throughout the play, which militarism plays into. Looking back again at Stelios' glee over the war's success and people's fighting spirit to distract from the disease, he's perfectly happy to keep charging the rich for cures that are inefficient and just don't work, while his allies, the Baron and the Marshal, profit from the war. Even his so-called solution of sending the lepers to camps would benefit them in this way, as he says that all citizens under 40 must undergo mandatory medical testing, no doubt at their own expense. And even Baron Krug says, while he has the plague, that his factories will need to increase the production of barbed wire as the demand grows for new camps. Čapek is commenting on how the rich and powerful use even times of crisis to their own gain. They see the poor as simply something to manipulate to ensure their best interests. Čapek's critique of greed and disinterest of the upper classes is further examined through Baron Krug's character. In the play, we're first introduced to him through a different character, through the father's character, when he describes his promotion after the deaths of his co-workers to head accountant. This immediately links us to Baron Krug's company and the absolute selfishness of one of his high-up employees. And further talk cements this because we hear that Baron Krug is building 6 new factories to aid in the war effort. We just kind of get this idea of him as someone who doesn't seem to care very much about people. When he does eventually appear on screen, he's donating to the leprosy fund, which seems to go against this, but we're very quickly made aware that he himself has the plague. Čapek is establishing 2 things here, that the Baron is very rich and very interested in helping himself. Krug is probably the most pointed critique of the greed of the rich, represented with a man with very little concern towards anyone in a lower social strata. And although not in the play, the film shows the explosion at his factory and his workers dying, but the Baron's simply satisfied that he has evidence that his sea gas works and then will be profitable. He sees morality and integrity as something viable and that money can get him anywhere. In his attempt to bribe Dr. Galen, he offers millions to buy the press to support his pacifism, which kind of seems to imply that he's been buying the press to support the war effort and his own profit. Even his eventual suicide actually feeds into this, as when his innumerable riches can't secure his recovery, he chooses death over the life of a leper. Čapek deliberately poses Krug as this figurehead for the rich and powerful to present a critique of their selfishness and greed. He shows us a cowardly man who's afraid to save himself by compromising his material gain, who would rather die than prioritise people over war and therefore profit. Finally, the character of the father shows how Čapek presents greed as almost parallel to the plague itself. The father character is introduced as a man entrenched in the military-industrial complex, working in Baron Krug's arms company as an accountant. He's a kind of middle-class, comfortable living. He's very ideologically vehement, but he doesn't really have a lot else going on. However, by Act 2, the character is developed significantly. In Act 1, he felt that the disease threatened him as a kind of foreign entity and as something that targeted over 50s. By Act 2, he's actually thanking his lucky stars for the plague as it's allowed him to secure this promotion through the deaths of his colleagues. Čapek uses this character to point out towards the link between greed and apathy. As father's wealth increases, he loses any semblance of remorse or consideration for the plight of others until it directly impacts him through his wife. However, when father and mother go to visit Dr. Galen, we see Čapek treat father's greed within the narrative as its own disease. His refusal to quit his job, even to save his wife, is viewed by Galen as a terminal diagnosis for mother. Galen seems to believe that curing the disease means nothing when there's a deeper moral sickness existing within their family unit. Čapek also asks us to understand this duality as he presents his critique on greed and selfishness of the wealthy elites. Unless they are willing to make sacrifices and materially improve the world, they are at least morally bankrupt. To conclude, Čapek's The White Disease is not an anti-Nazi play. Although many of its critiques can be applied to the Nazi regime, the greed and selfishness of the ruling elites, the lack of compassion for ordinary citizens, the destruction of a nation's humanity due to rampant militarism and nationalism. But the Nazis were not the first and will not be the last regime that fits these characteristics. Čapek's play is critical of the structures and resulting attitudes in place when violence becomes tied to a nation's self-image, and the positions this forces people into, whether at desperation or moral outrage. Overall, although applicable to their regime, Čapek's The White Disease is not meant to be a specifically anti-Nazi play, and instead forms a broader critique of regimes across the world and history that glorify violence and put profit before people.
That's brilliant. Eddie, I have a totally irrelevant question.
Yeah.
You were reading it from that piece of paper. How did you manage to get all of this stuff on that single piece of paper?
There's a few bits of paper.
Two papers.
I just folded them
Is
all
it
up.
more? All
But
right.
I also write very, very, very small.
All right. Okay. So, were you reading it, or are those only notes?
It's mostly notes.
Okay,
notes. There's a couple like sentences that I read in it. But
Well, you've analyzed it very well. Do you have any criticisms? All right. Okay. Nobody has anything. You want something to
I
add?
have one question about some situation in film. In the scene when Baron Krog comes to the Marshal after the visit to the doctor, why did Baron Krog ask the Marshal to save him, and why couldn't Baron Krog have stopped weapon production by himself? Why did he need to ask the Marshal for this?
I think, at least what I got from that scene was that the Baron goes to the Marshal because he's had this rebuffal from Galen. He's been told, unless you stop doing war, like, it's not going to happen. And he goes to the Marshal to, like, beg him for his life, basically. And the Marshal kind of says to him, like, you should do what you have to, but you can't do that. Like, you can't do that at all. And he kind of says that he'll try and intercede with Galen on his behalf. But at that point, I think Baron Krug realizes that it's not going to happen, and that's when he kills himself. So I think it's that kind of like realization that he's really going to have to either give it up completely or just face it and kind of deal. And we have the character of the Marshal eventually does go to the camps at the end of the film, but Baron Krug doesn't want to live that life. He doesn't want to kind of become a leper. He's too tied to his ideas of wealth and kind of his riches in the world.
As I understand it right, then like main reason was the fear, Baron Krog's
Yes.
fear, yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, you've actually pointed out something very interesting here, because if we actually think about it, he doesn't mind killing himself, but he minds giving up all the kind of making of the weapons. So he kind of feels that he has to kind of remain a part of that militaristic system. But does it really mean that when you kill yourself, you have remained the part of the militaristic system? There's a certain amount of kind of, yeah, you're right. There's a contradiction in it, no? Yeah. There's also actually various critics. There have been lots of criticism. We're saying whether Čapek really thought this out properly, right? Because actually, okay, imagine Dr. Galen would actually blackmail the world to sort of stop the wars, and they would all promise these governments, okay, we're not going to run any wars, so give us the medicine. He gives them the medicine and say, all right then, so let's go on with our wars then. So, I mean, he wouldn't have any guarantee in a way also. So, but of course, one other thing about Čapek, which is maybe quite interesting and maybe be seen as a criticism, various writers normally, when they write a novel or a piece of work, they write it in order to examine a problem. Maybe they're just trying to learn something and they don't have actually the final solution at the beginning of the work. And Čapek was often quite criticized that he actually, because he was quite of a philosophical nature, that he had already sorted all his problems, and he just presents these works that he writes as kind of classes of something where the conclusions had already been known. So I don't know how you want to consider this. Okay, you're still there but the picture is absolutely unstraight. All right. Anyway, thank you very much. That was good. Thank you. And let me, if I can do something about it, I'll edit it. That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. I'll edit it slightly, but so that this is just for the other people. This is really okay. I don't know. Well, probably my face will be so. So hello. So we. Oh, I see. It is actually quite blinding. That thing. So all right. Sorry, tortured you here for sort of half an hour. Thank you very much. It was a very good presentation. I just wanted to say a few words about tomorrow's film. This Těžký život dobrodruha, Adventurous Life is Hard. It is in a way an entertainment film again, not in a way, it is an entertainment film, and it is interesting for you to compare it with that easygoing one, the first one from week one, The Life is a Dog or whatever, from 1933. This one is from 1941, from the Nazi occupation, and the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia, allegedly in the first few years, it was all right, as it were, as some people are saying. Quite a lot of Czechs thought that they could get along with the Germans, and at the beginning it looked like it. Later on, of course, there was that assassination of the Reichsprotector of Prague, Heydrich, which was organized from Britain by these paratroopers, and then, of course, the Nazis really unleashed a campaign of revenge, killing people from 2 villages, arbitrarily executing people and all that. But still people went to the cinema throughout the Nazi occupation for all those 6 years, and films were being made. On Moodle we have an interesting document about what happened when the Nazis took over the film studios in Prague. And then there are a couple of things. I will now switch off the video because you can have a look at these topics on Moodle. One of them is this interview, and I think maybe I've already played it to you. You have to tell me at least bits of it, with this Czech television filmmaker, Jana Brdečková, who made this film, or this TV series about celebrity actors during sort of dictatorships like the Nazis and communists, this series which was called Bohema, and she talks very interestingly about it, and it's got English subtitles, and I've got an interview with her. Did I play it here? No? Okay, maybe when there's time I'll play it here, and I don't remember what I did in which class. This is total senility. Anyway, I've got too many similar classes. Okay, so the title of that interview is "Why did these dictatorships always feel the need to actually besmatter people, to sort of make them do things that they would have to be ashamed of?" Because really, it's interesting that the Czechs were eventually supposed to be all killed or deported or whatever by the Nazis. So I don't understand why the Nazi regime was so interested in actually persuading them to be enthusiastic about Nazism. I'll show you something, a video which is on Moodle about this, and it's really actually absolutely horrendous. So this film is very escapist in a way. It's just a kind of thriller again, and however, just want to point out a couple of things. Unlike the first one, which takes place in an open space during daytime in the hustling and bustling Prague of 1933, strangely, I don't know whether this was deliberate, this one takes place obviously in studios or studio settings, and whenever something happens outside, it is after nightfall, so it's quite claustrophobic for some reason, right? And then, and I don't want to talk about it in detail here, because let's leave it as a kind of a surprise. The film is totally spoiled by Nazi propaganda at the end, indirect Nazi propaganda. You'll see it tomorrow. But anyway, I'll now switch off the video and let's have a look at some of those materials on Moodle.